I've often been asked, how do you paint a night scene? To be honest, in 50 years, or about 50 years of painting watercolour, I've only ever painted two night scenes. One was in 2013, the other was in 2017. And after 2017, I said to myself, never again, quite difficult. But I'm bowing to pressure here after several recent requests to produce a night scene watercolour painting video. Hello, I'm Tim Wilmot, a watercolour painter, and I produce full-length video tutorials with commentary, which will help you improve your watercolour techniques, I hope, and create some great looking paintings. Now, painting a night scene, not many people do paint night scenes. I think maybe 99% of all paintings I've seen are in the daylight, particularly a sunny day. Painting a night scene can be difficult if you're doing plein air. Then you've got to be using some artificial light on your paper, and that must throw up some difficulties with getting the exact colours right. Being able to see in front of you, then you've got artificial light on top of your paper, quite difficult. And then painting from a nighttime, from a photograph of a night scene, judging the colours. A lot of night scene photos, they've been tampered with to enhance colours, and then that can be difficult trying to replicate that as well, particularly as a watercolour painting. So recently, someone sent me this photograph here. This is the lovely town of Nardo in Puglia in southern Italy. Hopefully I pronounced that right. I've never been to this location myself, but the photo attracted me. It's got some charm about it. From a watercolor point of view, lots of different areas of contrast. Look how dark the rooftop is there compared to the sky. We've got some lovely lights on the front of this. I assume this is a church. I'm not sure. Is this some sort of a restaurant or pizzeria? So some lovely light shining across the square. Maybe this is early evening, not totally in the dark. So we've still got a little bit of light in the sky. It's not a bright blue sky, but yeah, look at the contrast. They're really dark rooftops, the tops of this church here compared to the sky around it. And then light coming from different directions, mainly from these lights on the front of this building, and almost like a contre-jour. We've got some silhouetted shapes, so there's some figures in a cafe here, bottom left corner, some figures by this statue in the square, another cafe in the distance, light hitting those parasols as well, a car, lots of different objects to bounce the light off. So quite a challenging scene. This is only the third nighttime painting I've done. I'm going to make some mistakes. I'll probably most likely want to do it again or something similar again. Let's see how we get on. Now, the first decision I've got to come to is consideration of the dimensions of my paper. The size of my paper here is 15 inches across by 11 inches down. So it's a sort of 4x3 dimensions, if you like. And the photograph was very stretched out. It was almost 2x1. So I'm having to think about condensing the scene, but try and get it all in. I think the composition for me worked quite well with, on the left-hand side there, that was one of the first things I drew in there, the left-hand building, and then this main background building, the pizzeria, restaurant, a gap between the left-hand building and the pizzeria restaurant, and then over to the church facade in the middle, and then over to the right we've got a big monument. So I'm having to squash the scene up a little bit to suit my paper size. I'm not copying exactly the scene. I'm also having to sneak in the top of the church as well. I think I'll just about sneak it in. Ideally, well, you'll see at the end, ideally I should have maybe just come down just a smidgen, just a little bit lower to get in the very top of the church, but we'll see how things get on. There's the street level. So I'm thinking about perspective here, top of the building, the middle of the building, the street level. Here's the monument in the middle of the square. Lovely, very ornate monuments. Lots of complicated things going on. The circular base of the monument. And then in the bottom left-hand corner, there's a few guys in a cafe. I'm going to use that again in this composition, in this painting. A couple of figures sat down at a table. Now these are going to be silhouetted. I'm imagining there's a bit of shadow over on the left-hand side and a light behind them, throwing them into a silhouette. So all we can see are their main shapes. Likewise, a car in the middle of this square, and another figure here, trying to avoid the very center of the picture. I've done that a few times, I can tell you, and I regretted it later by having a dominant figure right in the middle. It's so easily done. I kicked myself afterwards, and yes, I try to avoid it in paintings now. So just off center, and then a couple more figures. As there was in the photograph, there were a few figures chatting by the monument in this early evening scene. I just cross-hatched there the face just to indicate my intention that that's the way the figures are coming. They're coming towards us. But I don't need to worry too much about colours of these figures. Again, they're going to be fairly simply done when I paint them in. Now, these are the parasols, umbrellas in front of the pizzeria. Under there will be some simple silhouetted figures. A key element of this nighttime painting are the bright lights in front of the on the building, their wall lights, and throwing some light onto the square. And at this stage, I really have no idea how I'm going to handle that in a watercolor painting like this. I'm thinking, shall I use a bit of masking tape over those areas, maybe cut out a small circle, maybe use some masking fluid. I've never got on with masking fluid, that rubbery mixture. Used it a few times as a teenager, never got on with it, ruined my brushes, never used it again. So I tend to leave the paper white. My preferred method at this stage, my thinking is pre-wet the paper, make those areas really wet, and then when I go in with my wash, gently paint around those areas of light, and then let the wash kind of seep in to create a very soft edge, or some soft edges, a little bit of a diffused edge to hopefully then get the feeling of that bright light. I may, if this goes well, I'll do another nighttime painting. Not the same scene. I generally don't like doing the same scene. I get bored very easily doing the same scene. Now I'm thinking about perspective there again, the very top of the church, a few windows. Yeah, so if I do this night scene again, I'll try and find something else. I have very few reference photos. I don't really personally take lots of nighttime photos if I'm out on my travels locally or further afield. So I'm very grateful for this painting submitted by somebody, and credits to them are in the comments of this video. This is not my own photo. A lovely wall light coming from the building on the left, and I've moved the light of that wall light to be in front of the darker area of the left hand side of the building, if you see what I mean. Now there's a standing figure here, maybe a waiter or somebody just coming out of their cafe, coming over to those two people sat at the table. And that is pretty much it from a drawing stage. I've used a 3B pencil. The paper I'm using is Saunders Waterford watercolor paper. Could be anything, but you tend to get used to paper and you know how it reacts, how it feels, and you just stick to it rather than chopping and changing the water. So changing the paper. So this is where I'm now dabbing in, putting in some water, making sure the paper is really damp in those areas. I'm using, for this first stage, I'm using a mop brush, a Raphael synthetic mop brush, and as I normally do, I will go in with the sky first of all and go over the roof area. So cover the sky, go over, overlap, go over the roof area. Now, in most of my other videos, I've gone through the painting in a fairly structured way, but as I say, this is the third time I've attempted a night scene, so I may be, you'll have to excuse me, I may be hopping all over the place, do something, then go on to something else, and then go back to what I was doing before. So excuse me, I will point that out as I go through. But so far, this is according to plan, doing the sky there. Notice a little bit darker in the top left corner. I'm imagining that the evening light is coming from the right hand side, or there's some brighter light to the right hand side. So the sky's a bit more intense in the top left corner. And now with a slightly thicker, so there's mistake number one. I've gone over that first light. That's why I drew those little circles. Hopefully those circles aren't too dark and they don't show up too much in the end painting. Something like this, you do need a few stabs at it to get it right. Missed out that bottom middle sky below the support for the wall light, so I had to go back for the blue again. That's what I mean. I'm just chopping and changing here, just thinking on the hoof. Paint around. That light might have now smudged it, made it a little bit more difficult to get that bright area. But anyway, we just keep going. Now, quite a bright left-hand wall, which is framing the scene quite nicely. I kept that in. I think it looks quite nice having that left-hand border there on the left side. And then continue over with a cadmium yellow that I'm using now in predominantly the scene. I want to try and keep the background building quite bright, but of course it goes a lot darker towards the top and a little bit darker down towards street level. Now I'm changing the intensity of the colours as I'm going further afield, so it's not all yellow. I've got in my palette a cadmium orange, a light red, a bright red, or as a Windsor red. So just really mixing up those different colours. I've got a tissue or paper towel here to stop the water travelling too much over those bright areas, and I just continue on. Honestly, the painting at this stage will look a total mess, and some people at the end of the wash stage, you think, crikey, what a mess. I think I'll just dump this and go off and do something else. But really you should just persevere, and hopefully a half decent painting comes out at the end of it. So I'm just introducing some different colours there: light red, bright red, alizarin crimson. I think the square here has got more of a reddish tone to it. Make it a bit cooler in the right hand corner, which was a bit of ultramarine blue. And then as I go up the church, I'm going to be going darker. In the bottom left corner, I don't need to worry about the colours there too much, because I'm going to be going over that with a much darker value to create those silhouetted shapes. Being careful here just to keep in the light hitting the side of those parasols. And this is the start of some really darker colour now at the top of the building. The sky has almost dried. Ideally it could be just a little bit drier, but it doesn't matter if I get a sort of soft edge, as long as I'm careful that the paint I'm using now, as I go up towards the sky, the edge of this building, as long as the paint is thicker in consistency and not too watery, I won't get any nasty blooms or cauliflowers appearing. So in the distance here, between the left-hand building and the main middle building, we can see in the distance a dark building. So that's it there. A little bit of a soft edge. Just feeling here how dark how dry the paper is. Still a little bit damp. So I've got to be, as I say, I've got to be careful with the ratio of water to paint. Bit of dark, thicker colour for the monument, and like the top of the church, the top of this monument is quite dark, so I picked up a bit of neutral tint. I should say my palette of colours from the top going down, I've got neutral tint, burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, viridian green, cobalt green. In the middle I've got cerulean blue, then cobalt blue, ultramarine blue, French ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, Windsor red, or it could have been a cadmium red. They're fairly similar in intensity. And then I've got a light red, a cadmium orange, and lastly a cadmium yellow. I do have also a lavender, which I use a bit for the sky. I felt the sky was not strictly speaking blue. It had a bit of a purplish hue to it. So that lavender worked quite well with a little bit of blue. As the sky is drying a little bit more now, I can more safely go up to the top of the pizzeria and get in the darker values. Now I'm having to think, these lights, these wall lights on the building, all these different sources of light and the direction of where the light is going, and it's compared to a daytime scene, the lighting is almost in reverse. So things that are facing downwards, they're being lit up. Whereas things that are facing upwards, they're in dark shadow because of the light below them. So I'm having to, this is why, well, one of the reasons why nighttime scene can be quite difficult with lots of street lights and wall lights on buildings, those various different light sources and throwing light into different areas. Now, top of the church here, bit darker. I've used some neutral tint. Same colour down the left-hand side of the building. You can see the brush. I'm using this mop brush from Raphael. How much is bent like that? So it works almost similar to a natural brush, and I find it's got just the right level of suppleness. Not too soft, not too hard, not too springy, and you can see it was bent quite nicely just to give you want a nice edge with a lot of this. If the paint isn't moving quite as much as I like, I do sometimes use my finger to smudge things, being careful not to overwork things too much. Here I'm having to again wet that one of those light areas. I found it had dried too much, and I can see whether it's dried too much just by taking a little peek against the light, and if the paper is shining, then it's still quite wet. But if it's gone quite dull, then I'm going into that kind of danger area where it's drying a little bit too much. Now, something quite dark for the far tower. There's a tower right at the end of, I guess it's a church, so maybe a bell tower or something like that, right in the distance. So big area of contrast against the lighter sky. And it just helps to give the impression of that early evening scene. Of course, the light being against the wall lights against the buildings, it's going to give me a fairly hard edge to the rooftop. There's no light hitting the tops of the roofs as we would have in a daytime scene. The light is coming from below, so don't want any lighter edge across the top of the flat roof. There's the side of the church. And then to the right of the church, there's a building going down the street with a rooftop there. And if I bring that over to the right-hand side, I'm defining now the left-hand edge of the monument in the middle. Go back to the left-hand side again. Don't want to put too much detail on the far left building, the building that's in the gap. I've changed brush now to a smaller mop brush where I do need a bit more precise control and a bit more softness to it, and a good point as well. Some of the squirrel mop brushes I use, this is the Jackson's brush, and it's got quite a nice point to it. This is a size 10 squirrel mop brush. There's some lines to define, give a bit of perspective to this bright yellow building framing the left-hand side. Bit of shadow underneath the support for the wall light. Get that hard edge on the rooftop. Some bits and pieces on the top of the roof. And the very top of this church now, I didn't draw it in exactly, so I'm having to think about perspective here and getting it look symmetrical as best I can. And there's some funny little statues on the edge of this top right corner of the facade. You see, with that dark, with those dark rooftops, it's just starting to look like a nighttime scene. Just beginning to turn around. I think with painting, you have to keep a little bit of faith and perseverance to get through it. And with watercolor, yes, it can be frustrating in that it can be difficult to change a lot of things, but some things can be changed. We can lift things out, we can make things darker. Of course, we're going from light to dark generally with watercolor. I know some watercolor artists may go from dark to light, but generally I go from light to dark. So as I'm going through the painting, I'm using darker values as I go through. And at the end, I might use a little bit of, a tiny little bit of white paint just to bring out some areas of light and little reflections and tops of the heads and so on. You'll see that at the end. Now, if I want to make this a little bit lighter as I come down, I've just picked up a little bit of clear water there, picked up a bit of water and just dragged down the darkness of the top of the church, just down a little bit lower. So I've got a bit of a graded wash going on. I'm coming a tiny bit dark as I come down the scene. This is the near side of the parasols, these umbrellas. And with this brush, I've got quite a nice point to it and quite a nice edge as well, with which I'll paint these figures in on the left hand side. Sometimes I might paint their faces in first of all, followed by their clothing, but these are silhouetted, so I'm just really almost in one fairly dark value painting in their silhouetted figures, loosely following the pencil lines I put in earlier, but with this brush it does some nice things, the way you move the brush around, and it can introduce some interesting changes to my initial drawing of those figures, which may turn out okay. So there I am again, still using the fingers to just move paint along. It's still, you can see there's a bit of a shine to the top of the church. It's still, that area there is still quite damp. I could still go in there with a darker colour, get some soft edges, some different textures in it, or could have put in a bit of splattering as well at this stage. That will work quite nicely. So another sat down figure, back of the chair. Doesn't matter if I leave out little gaps here and there. The first wash is showing through. It doesn't matter. It just hopefully adds to the charm of the freshness of it. And they could be little objects just catching the light, or as I'm doing now on the left hand side, I'm just really, with these brush marks, just creating the appearance of some objects, to the left of the table and chairs, maybe a stand or another table and chair, or figures. I need to keep that bottom left corner quite simple, really. And then thinking about the light direction, some lines coming out here, sort of pointing down, top left to bottom right, that sort of angle, to give the impression of some sort of this light I was mentioning, this light behind those figures. I'll continue now with just going across the scene really, because I'm right-handed. I'm generally going from left to right. There's the car in the middle. I've tried to connect the car with the figures on the left-hand side with that little bit of a dark mark there. The car is very simple. It's just really almost a square. It's silhouetted against the light in front of it. And There's another line of connection, and a shadow underneath the car, a little slither of light below the car, between the car and the road, and quite a short little shadow behind the car. So ultramarine blue, cobalt blue, neutral tint. Figures now in the distant cafe. Some standing, some sat down. Didn't actually really draw these in, so this is just freehand, which works best for me. A very thin shadow, because they're further away, the shadow is going to be a little bit thinner. Another figure, perhaps somebody standing up. And just a few strokes to paint in their legs below the table level, and obviously with lots of legs of chairs and tables, there's just lots of sort of little vertical and horizontal marks in there. Same brush, neutral tint, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, main figure sort of in the middle. See how I've got this figure connected, the shadows of the distant cafe, and then to the right of the figure, shadow continuing on at the back of the street, or going into that monument there. I think that's important rather than having it sort of on its own. Legs. Now this figure, I'm not 100% convinced I've got it right. It looks like this figure has been on the red wine too much and is kind of staggering across the square. But hopefully it's got a little bit of movement in it. And shadow, thinking about the light direction again. I was thinking about I was considering with the light, I could have, for example, the car. There's the light to the left, there's the light in front. I could have sort of two shadows, and there's a bit of an overlap where the shadow's more intense. I was thinking of doing that, but I've kept things fairly simple for this nighttime painting. The top of the monument is drying a bit more. I'm going in with thicker, darker paint, making it quite dark at the top of this monument. And with this brush, it's quite a good brush to create some quite dark verticals. Being a soft brush, and the paper surface is cold pressed, so it's got a bit of texture to it, and that creates some nice dry brush marks, which is useful when you're doing bold verticals or horizontals. A few narrower, a few thinner verticals on the side facing the light, and the base of the monument, or this statue, or well, I would describe it as a monument in the middle of the square. Far building beyond the monument, just on the right hand side. Two remaining figures. Different pose to them. I've sort of followed my pencil lines just as a little bit of assistance for me. But sometimes when I come down to the legs, I do change my mind. And probably out of the whole figure, the legs are done quickest. I think the more time you spend painting legs, the worse they're going to get, unless you're exceptionally clever with painting figures. Painting in a loose way like this has got to be done quite quickly. So putting in those dark figures, those dark silhouetted figures, together with the dark tops of the buildings, is starting to give the more of a convincing feeling now, hopefully, of a nighttime scene. Just to break up some of the, just to introduce a bit more texture in, particularly the bottom left corner where there's a lot of shadow there, I'm using a paper towel to lift a bit of the colour. It's still quite damp, just in a few areas. I don't want to overdo it, otherwise it will look a little bit messy. But while it's still quite damp, I can lift up like that, and the paint's still moving around, and it's still travelling a little bit, so I get still some soft edges being retained there. New brush now, a smaller detail brush. So with darker colours now, I want to start defining some of the architecture and detail of the buildings, windows, some markings on the road. I need a smaller brush for this. I'll be using less water at this stage, almost just using whatever water is on the palette already. Don't very often have to go back to my water container, pick up more water. It's very often there's enough on the palette already. So the top of this ledge has got to be darker than below, because there's a quite strong light, or stronger light coming from the bottom than the top. Couple of windows. And that vertical line going across has a few gaps in it, so I just want to break it up a bit, not having it too perfect a continuous line. Really, it's just the this building, the church, to add in a few windows and columns and things and whatever's on the front of the church, just define that a bit more. And it's going to look hopefully more realistic as a church. Going a lot darker with all these sort of mouldings and things at the top of the church. There's very little water on this brush now. It's quite thick paint. And the windows aren't perfect rectangles. They've got some imperfections, which is just the way I do things. A few columns. Some over to the right as well. Not too much detail on these because they are further away. Some aerials on the rooftops. Even if there aren't any, I might just put them in anyway, just to add a bit of interest, so that the rooftops are not too stark and a bit more interesting. Now, there's a main doorway, which I think it is a church, but I'm coming down to the top of the parasol just to give me a bit of contrast. So I do that quite a lot, to have something dark behind something light. Could be a car, could be a figure that's light, and then a doorway or a window behind that, just to define that object just a little bit more. It's just a case of trying to pull everything together at this stage. Knowing when to stop is a very important thing when painting in a loose style. I've painted more the top of the building just because I didn't want any lightness up there. There's no light really that should be up there, so I've covered over any light bits up there. Here's a window or a doorway of the restaurant. And then another one, like I did before, just have it touching the side of the parasol just to help define that edge, define the parasol a bit, and then down to the top of the roof of the car, just leaving a little bit of light on the top of the car there. Of course, some poles for the parasol, mustn't forget those. A few little faint horizontal marks on the monument. The actual road surface here, I'm painting a few lines, almost a sort of radial pattern, just to emphasize the I'm not sure if this is like a sort of roundabout in the middle of the square, but I've decided to paint a few lines there just to give this road a different structure to the pavement by the monument, and just to hopefully give the impression of the curve, the curvature going around there. At the top of that could be a little light, the actual light that's generating the light there. A few angular shadows. You can see I've got quite dirty fingertips now, which I've got to be careful I don't smudge the painting accidentally. Just to the right of the church, I feel it needs to be a little bit darker going down. I assume there's a street just church facade just to the right, so the road going down, and so I've just, this isn't the most ideal brush to do this with, but I've got it anyway, and just provide a bit more of an edge to the right hand side of the church. Couple of angular shadows maybe coming from the lights above the pizzeria. I know some people might be tempted to put in some signs above the pizzeria. I thought about that, but I think the signs in the photo, they're quite small, and it would just be too much, really, too much detail for this, so I haven't bothered to put that in. Quick drying now with the hairdryer, because when I go in with the white, with some white paint to highlight some parts of the painting, I want to make sure that the paint is really dry before I go in with the white. And I'll be using my small detail brush again. And white paint, this is white gouache, straight out the tube. Now I've put it over that light. This is me thinking, is that bright enough? As I say, I haven't done many night paintings. This is only my third one, and just feeling my way on this. And maybe the next one I might be tempted to use some masking tape over those light areas and then go all over with a wash and lift off the tape afterwards, and then just maybe with a brush just give me a soft edge up to that light area. So with this white paint, just a few dabs here and there, not too much. Perhaps the underneath the ledge just catching a little bit of light. Some of the people in the cafe as well. Part of the monument. The middle figure, head, shoulders, bit of the left arm. And then these two figures on the right. There might be some reflection coming into the window of the restaurant. And then in this bottom left corner, another white line there, just to sort of replicating some of the other horizontal lines I've got and some of the reflections. I definitely don't want to overdo things at this stage. Just a few very thin marks for that cafe at the back. So here is the end painting, how to paint a night scene in watercolor. My third attempt in 50 plus years. I'll definitely do it again. I quite like the way in watercolor you can get those contrasts. So for me, what worked was trying to decide how to render the bright lights. I went for a pre-wet strategy on this, which may not have worked. That line there, that's a hard line. I really didn't want that. That's probably a better light. I didn't tamper with that too much. This one I mucked up, had to go over with a little bit of white paint. Could have done that with all of them. That could have been, I could have gone over the whole building and then gone in with some thick white paint afterwards, and then maybe drag it out, perhaps in a star-like fashion. That could have given quite a nice effect. Or what I might do next time is I don't use masking fluid, but maybe with a little bit of masking tape, I could put that over these areas here, the side of the parasols, cut out some kind of a shape, sort of circlish or like a fan or a triangle for these lights here, and then just have a wash, go over the whole lot, still going darker into the edges, darker towards the top, darker towards the bottom, and then when everything is dry, peel off that tape, or maybe even before it's dried, so it's still quite damp, peel off the tape, and then just with a small damp brush, just tease in the paint into that lighter area, but still leaving white paper showing through. A busy Italian square, early evening, nighttime scene, lots of areas of contrast, the darker building, the darker silhouetted shadows. If you do want more inspiration, please go to my website, timwilmot.com. I'm also running regular online live watercolor tutorials. Plus, separate to that, I've got a presence on Patreon where you can have a lot more interaction with me and other artists. And we set ourselves monthly painting projects. So more details, go up to patreon.com/timwilmot. Thanks for watching. Catch up with you next time.